Automated podcast.
Welcome to Automated. I'm your host, Mark Verbenkov, and in this weekly podcast, we will be exploring the impact of emerging technology on jobs, society, as well as us, with business and technology leaders, researchers, and independent professionals across the world. So over the course of the discussions in the podcast, a number of larger trends have really come up. And one of the central ones is whether certain technologies automate or augment work. And if you've been listening to some of the previous discussions, this has not always been easily discernible with the technologies under question. So today's episode, however, looks at perhaps the clearest example of augmentation, and this is through exoskeletons. I think that most people, when they hear of an exoskeleton for the first time, they might initially visualize something like an Iron Man suit or the large and bulky suits from other movies like the second Aliens movie, or the Tom Cruise film The Edge of Tomorrow. Though the real-world suits are of course much less imaginative and deadly, they do however serve to support people in a wide range of environments and of course movements. My guest today to talk about this technology is Dr. Saskia Baltrusch. So Saskia and I actually work on a European project together, Accelerate. This is to both improve current industrial exoskeletons and help European SMEs accelerate their adoption. And though the project focuses on passive exoskeletons, which we'll talk about more in the discussion ahead, our discussion also covers active ones while also touching on military applications and the possible future versions of this supportive technology. Saskia is working as a research scientist at TNO in the Department of Sustainable Productivity and Employability. By conducting research in the field of new technologies in the working environment, such as exoskeletons and cobots, she aims to enhance the health of employees. Her current projects focus on accelerating the adoption of exoskeletons into industry and on human-robot interaction and its effect on job quality. So Saskia obtained her PhD at the Vrije Universiteit of Amsterdam in 2020. For 4 years, she was working on the development and evaluation of passive trunk exoskeletons for low back pain prevention and vocational reintegration. Her work resulted in multiple publications in international peer-reviewed journals, as well as numerous presentations at national and international conferences. So with her expertise in human factors, biomechanics, and ergonomics, she supports TNO to boost productivity, health, and comfort of employees. Great. Well, hi there, Saskia. Thanks for coming onto the Automated podcast. It's great to have you here today to talk about what I think would be a technology that many people might not have heard about, exoskeletons. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to be here today.
Great. So we'll be talking about exoskeletons. I think we'll get into a little bit of the definition of it in a bit, but I'd like to ask you, as kind of one of the things that I do with all my guests, what initially drew you into exoskeletons? What was kind of the main interest to get into the work that you do?
Yeah, well, I would say about 6 years ago, I haven't heard about exoskeletons at all.
Okay.
That's when I finished my master's in human movement sciences in the Netherlands. And then I was looking for PhD positions because I really wanted to do a PhD. Mm-hmm. And there was one coming up at a rehabilitation center, and it was a European project about actually building an own exoskeleton for the low back.
Okay.
And I was super interested because it sounded nice. It was something with technology, and I wanted to combine technology with human movement sciences and how does technology affect the human movement, basically. And then I thought, okay, I apply for that PhD position, and I was lucky, and I got the job. And that was when my first contact started with exoskeletons.
Okay.
And now 6 years later, I'm still busy with the same topic, and I like it, and it's super interesting. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. That's I like that. So we're both working on a project that deals with exoskeletons, and many of even some of the colleagues that work at the company that I'm at have never heard of exoskeletons before. So maybe I can get you to explain a little bit what exactly is an exoskeleton. From my understanding, there's kind of two main types. There's an active and a passive exoskeleton. Maybe you can just take us through a little bit so that the audience is kind of at the same level when we're talking about these technologies.
Yeah. So an exoskeleton is basically a wearable device, a device that you can wear that supports the user or the wearer of that device in certain movements. So it's supposed to reduce loading on certain body areas, I would say. Mm-hmm. So there are exoskeletons for the back, there are exoskeletons for the legs, there are exoskeletons for the shoulders or for the arms. So there are exoskeletons for different body regions. And like you said already, there are active and passive exoskeletons. But before that, maybe it's good to say it looks a bit like a backpack mostly, so people can really easily put it on and off. It's quite hard to, I guess, see an exoskeleton in front of you if you've never seen it before. But yeah, imagine it like a backpack. And yeah, that there are passive ones. Those are I would say, the less complex ones. And they work on a spring mechanism mostly, I'd say. So if you have, for example, a back exoskeleton, you have springs that run parallel to your back. And if you bend forward, for example, that's when your muscle active, or when your back muscles have to get active, you want to get support.
Right.
Then these springs get extended. They store energy. If you come up again, they release this energy again. And that's how you basically get support from the spring mechanism. That's how a passive exoskeleton works. And yeah, the active exoskeletons also come with a motor or a battery. And that could be an advantage in case, like if you want more support, even though nowadays in the research, you don't really have active exoskeletons that show more support, but I can come back to that maybe later.
Sure.
And active exoskeletons are more complex, but you can also program certain stuff better. So you could say, with an active exoskeleton, you can say it's set the certain timing of support. When do I want to have my support? I don't want to only have a support whenever I do a movement, because that's what happens with a passive exoskeleton. Maybe I want to have it at a certain timing only if I pick up this heavy box, because that's actually when I have the loading on the back. Or maybe I want to have a gradual increase of the support. Things like that are better to program with an active exoskeleton than a passive one, which makes it more attractive maybe, but also more complex and also more difficult to use and to
and more expensive because of that.
And more expensive.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so if we're talking about the technology as acting as kind of the main thing is supporting, muscle movements and movements in general of humans, what are some of the places that these, again, maybe it's good to separate both the active and the passive types. Where are they being used in the most often kind of applications?
If we talk about passive ones, mainly, I would say, because those are mainly used right now, somewhere in industry or in healthcare. I could start with healthcare, but I'm mainly busy with exoskeletons in industry, but there are exoskeletons in the healthcare sector, but they're mostly for, they're like a full body suit exoskeleton, I'd say. And they're mostly for people with, for example, spinal cord injury who can't walk anymore. And they're also active with motors because, they have to make people be able to walk again. So we also had one of those exoskeletons at the rehabilitation center where I was working, and sometimes you can see patients walking along the corridor and they were just trying to walk again with an exoskeleton.
Can I just pause you on that? So I mean, I haven't personally experienced somebody using one of those, only in maybe a TED Talk or something like that. Was there any kind of like monumental psychological change that somebody who was paralyzed was able to walk, even though of course they have this body suit on them, this exoskeleton on them? Was there any kind of like real mental change that overtook these people?
I'm not sure. Like I see these patients walking there, and I think they do like that because they are able to stand up again, they are able to walk again. It takes quite a long time till you can really walk a couple of or 100 meters or so. In the beginning, they can do like 5 steps to that thing.
Right.
Because what they have to do is they have to basically shift the body a bit forward, and by that they activate how the exoskeleton starts moving. And it's quite hard to learn that, I think, but I do think they enjoy it because they have more and more patients doing it. But whether there was a big mental change, I don't know. No, but I could imagine. But they always have to also use how do you call those,
like a harness,
like the sticks that you need to walk. So they can't do it with hands-free yet, which doesn't make them really fully independent yet. So
right. Well, I guess that's where the technological development is going to happen over in the next 5-10 years or something like that.
Probably, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then next to the healthcare sector is then the industry. And there you see a lot that, for example, in the automotive industry, where people have to work a lot above their head, for example, and they just have to hold their arms a lot over their head for a really long time, that they really have problems in their shoulders because they do that a lot, 8 hours a day. And there is just a really big demand of something that can support them. And especially in jobs where you can't automate processes, you really need a wearable device for these people. And then an exoskeleton comes in super handy because they can wear that, they can rest their arms on that, and then they hopefully don't get shoulder problems anymore in the future, which also makes the company have less costs for people who have to be on sick leave or whatsoever.
Yeah, and I guess this would also be when this gets scaled up, right? Because there are many different motor company or automobile companies in Europe, but also in the States and in China and other places, right? When it's scaled up, I think a lot of these health impacts is going to put wear and tear on the health system, and especially now in our age when I think everybody's a little bit more aware of the current limitations of the health system. A technology like this reducing those stresses is more beneficial now than I think even in the past.
Definitely, yes. And not only in prevention but also in helping people who already have it. So and you can also see that if you talk to these people who are using them already, mainly the people who have problems or had problems already, pain in the back, pain in the shoulders, are quite positive about these exoskeletons. People who didn't have any problems yet are more like, why should I wear this?
Right.
It's a bit like, why should I stop smoking? I don't have any problems. Well, maybe the problems come in like 10 years or so. Yeah.
Interesting. And so we're talking about these, muscular disorders that people have from, working with their hands up or their arms up all day long. Is this the main benefit that exoskeletons have? Are there other things that it's able to do, or is that really the main kind of added value that exoskeletons have within industry?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I would say it is one of the main benefits, and of course also one of the main reasons why you use these things. In my research, we also did research on, does it affect self-confidence in your own body, basically, which was also quite interesting. And we found that it can basically, increase the self-confidence in your own body. So we did that with patients who had low back pain for a long time already. And we wanted to know if they wear this exoskeleton, do they get back their self-confidence in their own body? Because these people often have problems with, I can't do anything anymore. I don't dare to do this movement anymore. And so I think that's also something that an exoskeleton could be useful for. But I also know from conversations with a lot of doctors and healthcare professionals that they're quite skeptical about this idea.
Okay.
So yeah,
is that
interesting?
Is that, I'm just curious, is that because they haven't seen too many use cases of this, or they're just skeptical about the technology having that kind of psychological benefit?
I think they're skeptical that this psychological effect is actually a benefit. I think they're afraid of, I think we're just going to make them more dependent on something. So they think, okay, patients just get dependent on this device. They think, I can't do anything without this device anymore. And that was their main concern. And of course, you don't have any use cases yet because it's not used with patients anywhere yet. So we just wanted to know their thoughts about that and whether this is an idea. The patients were quite positive and the healthcare professionals were quite negative.
Okay. Interesting.
That was interesting.
One of the other things that I've come across when dealing with exoskeletons is the payload of it, right? So I know that the passive exoskeletons, I mean, sometimes they don't even go all the way up your arm; they only go kind of to your bicep or your tricep, and so that you're able to hold your arm up a little bit more. I think that maybe payload would be a little bit more relevant for the active exoskeletons, right? I think a lot of people that would be listening to this immediately go to like an Iron Man idea, right? Where they have
Yeah.
a fully motorized, suit on that enables them to get almost kind of superpowers or something like that. Do you know what kind of limitations there are for the active exoskeletons out there right now, specifically regarding
How much
payload?
load you can put
Yeah.
on the exoskeleton?
Yeah.
Um, I'm not sure for the active ones, no. But I do know that you also don't want to reduce the load, or you don't want to support the person too much, because the idea of an exoskeleton is not to, let's say, make super power to that person. So the person
Yeah.
can just, instead of normally handling loads of 15 kilos, handling loads of, I don't know, 35 to 40 kilos. That's not what you want. You want actually that this person still does the same work, but then with less loading on whatever body region it is.
Yeah.
And so I also think it's not really correct to think about payload and how much load can we maximally put on this exoskeleton, because that's not the goal that we have as an exoskeleton.
Okay. That's a good point.
So yeah.
One of the other questions that I have is when I first heard about exoskeletons, I was able to go to a conference in Germany about them, and there were some interesting passive and I think one or two active exoskeletons that were being showcased. People were trying them on, lifting their arms and stuff like that. But at the very end of the conference, there was a demonstration of a military exoskeleton, and it was interesting to see like the whole room kind of go quiet. You had I think he was an ex-soldier, try on the military exoskeleton, and he was able to run back and forth across the stage. Can you maybe, if you know, like what is the difference in technological advancement between like military exoskeletons and industry and healthcare exoskeletons? Is there a big divergence between the two, or are the kind of technological states of the art more or less at the same?
Well, the goals are different, I would say. Why do you use this exoskeleton? So for military, there are also exoskeletons, for example, that try to transfer the loads of a heavy backpack during walking to the ground, for example.
Right.
So people can walk longer with a heavy backpack. And I think that goal is just different than the goal in healthcare sector or in industry. Because there's more about, actually they have to endure a task longer, or they should just perform a task longer with the same load, instead of trying to prevent them from musculoskeletal disorders, I would say.
Right.
And I think the technical advancements are around the same, I would say.
Okay.
Interesting is also, like, I'm actually busy right now also in a project with the Armed Forces of the Netherlands, so they're also interested in exoskeletons. But there they actually have a bit the same problem. So they also have people with shoulder problems, with back problems, and they just want to know, can we use exoskeletons in different locations within their armed forces? And we just travel to all these locations and have a look, and it's quite difficult to give a good advice, because there are so many different tasks, and a lot of tasks are also just with so heavy weight that you would say weights of 45 kilos. Does it make sense to have an exoskeleton then? No, not really. So yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. So maybe then we can back up a bit. What are some of the specific tasks? Maybe, I mean, we already talked about the tasks that are overhead in, say, the automotive industry, but are there other tasks that exoskeletons are being used for in general?
Well, depends on the exoskeleton, of the type of the exoskeleton. But for example, static forward bending is a task that is pretty good supported by an exoskeleton. But if you then think of, well, where in a job do you always have constantly static forward bending. That doesn't really happen that often.
Yeah.
So there's always a trade-off between, there are certain tasks that are good to support with the exoskeleton, but there are a lot of other tasks that they also do in that job, and they're maybe not that good to be supported by an exoskeleton. But static forward bending is one, then lifting, for example, also, but then it depends how much weight, because from a certain weight on, it's just too heavy and the exoskeleton can't give relative the support that it should give. Then for the shoulder exoskeleton, it's working overhead, but also if the arms are a bit lifted, they also get support already, the people. Those are the main tasks, I would say. And then if you think of people performing these tasks, we, for example, had a workshop with roofers on the roof, because they stand a lot in forward bending position.
Right.
But also, for example, dentists already started maybe thinking about using it, because they always stand in a really static forward bending position, but then in small angles, and that's still a challenge actually, and that's where maybe an active would be better, because if you think of a spring mechanism, you have to load the spring, and the loading starts at bigger angles. So if you're in the small angles, you don't really get that much support yet. So then it might be a good idea to use an active one, because then you can say, I want to have support, 100% support at a really small bending angle, for example.
Yeah, and then if it's just a small angle, you wouldn't need such a big motor. And I've seen some of these exoskeletons, and some of them are quite bulky. So I guess it depends on the industry that they're working in, but it might get in the way of say a dentist doing some fine detailed tasks.
Yeah.
I want to go back. I was thinking, we were talking about military, and then you brought up roofers as well. So do you know if there are any kind of limitations based on the environments that people are using them in? If it's like too hot, because this is something that goes directly onto your body. Is there any kind of limitations in that sense?
Yeah, I remember we once talked with people from a steel industry, and there the environment itself is really hot, and they're getting contact with a lot of hot material, and that can be a limitation. That just the exoskeleton gets too hot.
Yeah.
We're right now busy with people with plasterers.
Okay.
And there the question is, so they now get an exoskeleton for 6 weeks, and they try it on, and we hope that they like it, but we see. And there's a lot of dust involved. So that's also a question. Does the exoskeleton still function the same way after 6 weeks? Because these plasterers might not clean it every day, and you also don't want to do that. Then water is maybe also a problem if it comes, if it gets wet or whatsoever. Those are the things I can think of right now. And sometimes we also have use cases where you need small adjustments, and then, which is quite nice, the exoskeleton developers are quite, because it's still on a really small scale that they develop it for use cases, they are still quite open to say, okay, we can do a small adjustment, and that this is a specific exoskeleton for your specific use case.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, maybe that's a good segue into kind of one of the last questions here. It's also one of the things that I like to end these podcast episodes on, is kind of like the future outlook of these exoskeletons. So you're saying, many of these producers, it's not really at large scale yet. They're still maybe even trying to find the specific applications where exoskeletons can fit. What do you see in, say, like the next 5 to 10 years? Are more industries going to be taking up exoskeletons? Is the technology going to get better? Maybe you can lay out a little bit of a future vision, if you will.
I think like the exoskeleton technology started like maybe 10 years ago, I'd say. And we're still in the beginning.
Yeah.
So like I said, everything is on a small scale. They can do still specific changes for specific use cases. So I do think that the demand will increase. More people will get aware of it. I mean, we're both now also in a project that actually tries to increase the awareness that there are exoskeletons that they can use. So I think these kind of projects are useful and really important to make people aware that there is this technology. And I do think that more people will use it, because I see a lot of potential of it, especially for an arm exoskeleton, because it's quite simple. It's quite it sits quite tight on the body. It doesn't interfere too much for people. So I do think there is a lot of potential. What I find dangerous also about this whole exoskeleton technology coming up is that sometimes people forget, or companies forget, that the exoskeleton should never be the first solution. So if you have a problem, people have, I don't know, shoulder problems or something, or they have problems in the back because they always have to lift from ankle height or whatever, then try to first find other solutions. Can you maybe increase the lifting height? Can you change something in the working environment? Can you say the person it doesn't have to do this 8 hours long, but actually can switch between tasks or whatsoever? And those things should be considered first before considering the implementation of an exoskeleton.
Right.
And I know from people, from the exoskeleton developers, they sometimes get called and, hey, we're interested in exoskeletons. And then they come by and then they look at this use case and they're like, well, there's a lot to change here, but not with an exoskeleton.
Right.
Because, yeah, you first really have to try to use the standard things of ergonomics, make it an ergonomic, positive way of working, and not, okay, I just solve everything with an exoskeleton.
Right.
And that's what I hope is not going to happen in the future. And that's also something that we should, bring out there to the people, that they know that this is not the first solution.
Yeah, it's not a panacea to all of your industry's problems, right? There are potentially other things that you can do beforehand, before implementing a really cool technology.
And I also think that the active exoskeletons, like right now, they're still not that much advanced. So there are a lot of research going on active exoskeletons, and I'm really curious about how they develop, because I see a lot of potential with active ones as well. But they're still, like you said, heavy, because you have extra motors and batteries and heavy stuff people just don't really want to wear during their work. So I'm really curious whether people come up with good solutions from active exoskeletons that can also be helpful in limitations that passive exoskeletons still have.
I couldn't agree further. I think the last question I'll ask you, and this is, I'm just remembering now an article that I read a while ago. So we've been talking about, passive and active exoskeletons, and I think this question is more closely tied to passive exoskeletons. But what I read was there are, and I'm going to put in quotations, exoskeletons that are kind of built into clothing. So you have like, I think it was even like some sort of elastic band, some industrial strength and industrial bands built into clothing to mimic some of the capabilities of the exoskeletons, the passive ones. Have you heard of that? Is that something that's growing as well? Is that something that's getting more research and funding and looking into? Because it sounds like a really interesting technology as well.
I haven't heard about like that they're in the clothing. I did hear about, you also have rigid exoskeletons and soft exoskeletons, and soft exoskeletons are mainly out of straps, like you said. And I could imagine that you could wear these straps also underneath the clothing or build it into clothing, probably possible.
Right.
The thing about these soft exoskeletons is that they're limited in support. And so I do think in terms of moving in these exoskeletons is nicer, because a lot of people with these rigid exoskeletons, they say, it limits me in the way I move, and I feel like I can't really move freely. And with these soft ones, it feels like that you can move better and you still get support. But the question is that enough support that you're going to prevent musculoskeletal disorders?
Right.
But I'm curious whether they're going to improve that somehow. But I do see a potential of these soft ones as well, because they just limit people less and they probably like to wear it more. But the question is whether the support is sufficient.
It really seems like you have from the soft exoskeletons, which are more or less clothing, all the way to these large, bulky active exoskeletons that enable you to have a significantly more support. Maybe we'll see in 20 years or so the lines of those two things coming together, having a lot of support in the in something that's not quite as bulky.
You basically need a trade-off between how much do you still want to move in it and how much support do you need.
Awesome. Saskia, thanks a lot for coming onto the podcast. I think it's been a really good kind of introduction to this type of technology, which, as I mentioned to you before we started, hasn't really been talked about on the podcast before. So I want to thank you for that. Where can people follow you? I'll have your LinkedIn profile up on there. Is there somewhere else that people can kind of see your work, maybe the research that you've done? I'd love to have that on the show notes as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It was fun talking to you.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks.
Thanks.
Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear and you want to support the podcast and the conversations here, the best way to do this is to go onto Apple Podcasts and leave a review, as it helps the algorithm to reach out to new listeners and brings the show to them. Also, feel free to check out the website, automatedpodcast.org, where you can find the show notes for each episode, written articles on the themes of the podcast, and a library of resources on the topic of emerging tech and automation. Also, if you want to reach out and leave any feedback or you have any questions about the podcast or any of the conversations, there are general contact links such as email, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. for you there on the website. And finally, for those of you that want more than just an audio conversation, the video recordings are now going to be up on YouTube for the newer conversations, so feel free to check out the videos by searching for Automated Podcast on YouTube, where of course you can like and subscribe if you prefer to support the podcast that way.
The Automated Podcast.